Some discoveries aren't just old, they're terrifying. What happens when we unearth a secret from the past that was meant to be forgotten? Today, we're exploring 3 of the most chilling archaeological finds ever made. Our journey begins on a sweltering morning in Peru where an archaeologist was about to come face to face with a nightmare. On a sweltering January morning in 2015, a 45-year-old archaeologist named Johnny was on a remote hillside in Palpa, Peru, squinting up at the barren slope above him. He'd been out here for 3 days now, hiking these desolate hills with nothing but a backpack, some water, and a folder containing a single grainy black and white photo from the 1970s. But right now, trudging up this particular hillside for what felt like the 100th time, he was starting to wonder if he'd finally lost his mind. As he ascended higher, he noticed something, that there were these arrangements of stones that were scattered across the hillside that seemed deliberate. They didn't form any clear patterns, and he thought that these were probably just old agricultural terraces or maybe natural erosion patterns. Because people had been living here for thousands of years, there would naturally be some human modification of the landscape. But the more he continued climbing, the more he would encounter these strange stone arrangements. And the weird thing was, they were covering a massive area. We're talking about like 60 to 70 meters across this entire hillside. And this was when he decided to talk to some of the local residents who lived in the valley below. When he actually described what he was looking for, showing them the old photograph, they just shook their heads because they didn't know what he was talking about. Even though they had lived there their whole lives, their family had been there for generations, nobody had ever seen anything unusual on this particular hillside. Completely stumped, Jonathan really had to sit back and think, whatever was in that 1960s photo must be gone now, destroyed by erosion or development or who knows what else. So the following day, he went back up the hillside, and this time he tried to actually map out what he was seeing. And he'd walk along one line of stones, marking it in his notebook, and then he would move to another section. And as he did this, he began to notice that these arrangements were actually taking shape in a way that looked human-like. On one, there was what appeared to be an arm extending from a larger mass of stones, and at the end of that arm, there were these circular arrangements that looked disturbingly like a head. He was thinking that this couldn't be right, that he was probably just seeing patterns that weren't really there, the way people see faces in clouds. But the more time he spent, the more convinced he became that these weren't simply random patterns. And at the end of what he thought might be an arm, there was this distinct arrangement of stones that looked exactly like a human head, which means it appeared as if the figure was holding a severed head. This made Johnny, or Jonathan, genuinely unsettled. The ancient cultures of this region, particularly the Paracas people who lived here thousands of years ago, practiced ritual head-taking. But surely this couldn't be a representation of that, right? Feeling he needed a different perspective, he climbed to a higher point on an adjacent hill, somewhere he could look back at the slope that he had been investigating, and when he turned around and looked back, his heart nearly stopped, because from this vantage point, with the afternoon sun hitting it just right at the right angle, he could see it clear as day. All those seemingly random stone arrangements weren't random. They formed the outline of a massive figure well over 65 meters long, and it wasn't human. This was a mythological creature, a deity from the ancient Paracas religion. It had a human arm extending from its body, and yes, it was holding a severed human head. There were more heads depicted inside its body and what appeared to be a fish near its mouth. This was the mythical killer whale, one of the most important supernatural beings in this ancient religious pantheon. But the geoglyph was so weathered, so faint after years of erosion that from ground level, it was essentially invisible. I mean, you could walk right over it and never know. That 1960s photograph he had with him was of this lost geoglyph. And in fact, what he had discovered would turn out to be one of the oldest in all of Peru, created what they estimate around 200 BC by the Paracas culture. And this even predated the famous Nazca lines by several centuries. This means that the Paracas had used 2 different techniques to create this. Some parts were made by scraping away the dark surface stones to reveal lighter soil, creating these outline trenches, but the other parts, including the eye of the whale, were made by actually piling up stones to create raised features. What's interesting is the reason that German researchers had lost track of it in the 1960s was because they had recorded the wrong coordinates. They were off by enough that future researchers were looking in the wrong area entirely. And because the geoglyph was on a slope rather than flat ground like the famous Nazca lines, it had suffered much more erosion from rainfall and just gravity over time. In 2017, a team of 6 specialists from Peru's Ministry of Culture would join John to carefully clean and restore the geoglyph. They removed centuries of debris, outlined the stones more clearly, and stabilized the area against erosion. The killer whale geoglyph was formally recorded with precise GPS coordinates, ensuring it would never be lost again. Today, it's part of a protected circuit of ancient geoglyphs in Palpa, and it's considered one of the most important archaeological discoveries in Peru in recent decades. The archaeologist who discovered this had been studying the ancient cultures of Peru for over 25 years, and since 1989, he'd been co-directing a major archaeological project in the region. His name was Johnny Ayla Cuadrado. On the afternoon of August 27, 1849, a lieutenant in the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers stood next to his horses in the middle of the New Mexico desert, wiping sweat from his forehead with his dusty sleeve. He was leading a small detachment of soldiers that had just broken away from Colonel Washington's main force, and they were supposed to be heading back to Santa Fe after a brutal military campaign against the Navajo. The campaign had been successful, if you could call it that. They'd secured a peace treaty after a nasty skirmish where the Navajo leader, Narbona, had been killed. And now, as the main army marched east toward home, this lieutenant had been given permission to take a quick detour with a handful of men to investigate something their Navajo guide had mentioned. Supposedly, there were these old ruins nearby, maybe worth documenting for the official report. Army topographical engineers were basically the scientists of the military, and they were always poking around looking for interesting geographical features or old settlements to map. The lieutenant had already seen dozens of abandoned native dwellings scattered across the land, just, small structures, maybe a few rooms, nothing special, so he figured this wasn't going to be all that exciting. But the guide, who had been walking ahead of them for hours without saying much, suddenly stopped and pointed toward a gap in the mesa ahead. He then said something in Navajo that the interpreter translated as the house in the blackened gap. The lieutenant, of course, thought that was a very oddly poetic way to describe old ruins, but he figured it was just how the Navajo talked about these things. What was very strange, though, was the guide's entire demeanor changed as they got closer. He had been very comfortable leading them through this area, but now as they approached, he seemed almost afraid. And he kept looking over his shoulder, and he was speaking in whispers, even though there was nobody around. The lieutenant could obviously sense there was something wrong, and the guide just told him that his people didn't like to go to this place because the ancient ones had built it. But of course, he just nodded and made a mental note for his journal, writing it off as typical native superstition. As they rode through the gap in the mesa, the lieutenant expected to see maybe a handful of crumbling buildings, but as the canyon opened up before them, he pulled his horse to a stop and just stared, because rising from the canyon floor were walls, and massive ones. Stone walls that stood 3 to 4 stories high, stretching across the landscape in what was kind of like this perfect geometric pattern. The artist traveling with them, a man named Kern, was supposed to be sketching maps and other notable features, actually dropped his materials when he saw it. And in fact, the nearest building was enormous. The lieutenant tried to count the rooms as he could see from the outside, and he kept losing track after 200. All the men could clearly observe that the walls were precisely cut out of stone and fitted together so perfectly you couldn't even slip a knife blade between them. The guide, though, just started freaking out and refused to go any closer, and explained that his people had a name. They called this place the Horizontal Rock Gap, which meant that it had basically been empty since before the guide's grandfather's grandfather's time. Supposedly, The builders had been very powerful who had vanished long ago, and that's all he would say about it. The lieutenant and his men dismounted and approached on foot, and every man in that detachment felt something shift in their understanding of where they were and what they were looking at. The first structure they entered didn't make any sense because it was shaped like a perfect letter D with the curved side facing south. The lieutenant had studied architecture at West Point, and he knew this wasn't random, that this was by design. Now, the Spanish had already been in Mexico for centuries. Maybe they had built some kind of massive mission here that had been forgotten. But Kern pointed out something that made that theory fall apart. The wooden beams in the ceiling, the ones holding up the multiple stories of stone, were ancient and so weathered and dry that they looked like they might turn to dust if you touched them. Whatever this place was, it had been abandoned for a very, very long time. At this point, the lieutenant had ordered his men to spread out and explore, but to be very careful because the structures, while they looked stable, could possibly collapse at any moment. And this is when he went around and took measurements and counted doorways and made all the notes he could possible in his journal. After he got done, he had a really hard time making sense of his notes because the main building alone had at least 600 rooms, which is bigger than most American towns in 1849. As they explored further, they found another massive structure a short distance away, just as large, just as complex. And in fact, the canyon was full of them. They were so mind-blown that they were convinced nobody was going to believe them. When they filed their report back in Washington, people would think they were making it up or had been drinking. One of the soldiers then called out because he had found something carved into a rock face. Symbols, writing of some kind. And so the lieutenant and his team hurried over and they just stared at these inscriptions. They weren't Spanish. There were no native languages that he recognized because they were older. Nobody had any idea what it meant, but they traced the symbols onto paper, thinking someone back east would be able to decipher them. That night, they made camp at a respectful distance from the ruins, and all of them just had this really strange feeling about what they had found that day, and they didn't really want to sleep any closer to the ruins than they absolutely had to. But over the course of this evening, as the lieutenant was compiling his final notes together for the main report, a soldier had suggested that maybe it was built by the Aztecs, that maybe their empire had actually extended much further north than anyone knew, or it could be some completely unknown civilization. Regardless, they were all convinced that this was going to change the way that everybody thought about the American Southwest. And over the next several days, they systematically explored and documented the canyon. His team produced detailed floor plans and sketches of all the major structures. They collected pottery fragments and tools, and they wrapped them up to take them back as evidence. And on their final day, the lieutenant climbed up to a high point where he could see the entire complex spread out below him. And by his count, there were at least 10 major structures, each containing hundreds of rooms. It's evident that whatever ancient culture lived here had to have been in the thousands, which meant they were thriving. More disturbing is that there were no signs of violence or evidence of invasion or disease. It's like they just simply walked away one day and never came back. The Navajo guide they brought with them refused to even go up there, saying that this culture vanished because they had become too powerful and the spirits had forced them to leave. What the lieutenant didn't know was that he had just documented one of the most important archaeological sites in North America. The structures he measured and mapped had been built between 850 and 1250 by the ancestral Puebloans. This sophisticated culture had created a trade network spanning thousands of miles. The city had been a center of commerce, ceremony, and political power for 4 centuries before being abandoned in the 13th century. The building he had spent so much time originally measuring was Pueblo Bonito, which would become one of the most studied archaeological sites in the Americas. The symbols he'd copied would eventually be recognized as part of a complex system of astronomical markers and ceremonial notations. Additionally, the Navajo weren't the only ones who knew about this place. The Hopi and the Zuni all considered it part of their ancestral homeland. And within a year's time, the lieutenant's report began to circulate widely. Over the coming decades, thousands of artifacts would be excavated. It all revealed a culture of incredible sophistication, from turquoise vintage jewelry from hundreds of miles away, copper bells from Mexico, seashells from the Pacific, feathers from tropical birds. This was an extremely advanced trade network. Even the architecture was aligned with solar and lunar cycles with a precision that wouldn't be fully understood until the 1970s. The place the lieutenant had spent those few days documenting was Chaco Canyon, and his report would be cited by every archaeologist who came after him, the baseline from which all future research would build. The lieutenant who led this expedition was James Harvey Simpson. His accidental detour to investigate some ruins would transform our understanding of American prehistory forever. On a sunny morning in 1903, a 30-year-old Austrian engineer named Arthur Poznański stood on a windswept plateau in western Bolivia, staring at something that didn't make any sense. He had traveled weeks to reach this remote location, about 3,800 meters above sea level near the shores of Lake Titicaca. He'd come here because he'd heard stories from people about ancient ruins that defied explanation, but now he was at a place that the locals called Pumapunku, which meant door of the puma. He realized the stories hadn't done justice, though, to what he was seeing. And the stones in front of him were enormous, some weighing over 100 tons, but it wasn't their size that blew him away. These blocks had been cut with surfaces so smooth and angles so sharp that when he tried to slip a sheet of paper between the two, he couldn't do it. The joints were completely flush. And this had supposedly been achieved by people who didn't even have metal tools. So he took his time, he walked slowly around the ruins, just running his hands along the stone surfaces, feeling for any imperfections or any sign of crude workmanship that would make sense for something built by ancient people. But as far as he could see, every cut was perfect and every angle was exact. This was at a machine level in terms of precision. Now keep in mind that Arthur was an engineer by training, not an archaeologist. Local archaeologists and other historians just claim that they were built by the Tiwanaku culture, which was roughly around 1,300 years ago. He knew that that was not the answer to this mystery, and he was going to find out what. Over the next several weeks, he began conducting his own surveys and measurements. He sketched every structure, photographed the stones, and documented every unusual feature. He became more convinced that something extraordinary had happened here, something that mainstream archaeology was just missing out on completely. One day, while he was measuring the alignment of a structure called the Kalasasaya Temple, he noticed something strange. The corners seemed to be oriented to mark the sunrise and sunset on the solstices. This wasn't unusual because lots of ancient structures were aligned with celestial events. But when he checked the current position of the sun during the solstice, the alignment was off by several degrees, actually. The implications were that the Earth's axis wobbles very slowly over thousands of years, a phenomenon called axial precession, which meant that the position of celestial objects relative to Earth gradually shifts. If you built a structure aligned to the solstice sunrise today, in 1,000 years that alignment would be slightly off too. He began calculating, and based on how far off the alignment was, he could work backwards to figure out when the structure would have been perfectly aligned. After doing very, very thorough math and rechecking his calculations, he had his answer. According to what he did, the temple would have been perfectly aligned with the solstices around 15,000 BC, which would make Pumapunku not 1,300 years old, but actually around 17,000 years old. To verify this, he spent the next several days measuring other structures, including the famous Gateway of the Sun, and each time his calculations gave him similar dates. Everything pointed to the same impossible conclusion, that there was a civilization that had been built at the end of the last ice age. But it gets even more interesting because as he spent more time walking around, he noticed what appeared to be ancient shorelines carved into the surrounding mountains. And these wave-cut terraces were hundreds of feet above the current level of Lake Titicaca. Local indigenous had legends about a great flood that had destroyed an ancient civilization, and so when he looked at the layout and the structure of these places, he realized it looked exactly like something else. a port. The massive blocks, the precise construction, this would have been an ancient shoreline, and all this was starting to fall into place and make perfect sense. This place had not been built by simple farmers 1300 years ago. This was an advanced maritime civilization, and when water levels were completely different. This was evidence of lost technology, a civilization that had been destroyed by a catastrophic flood. After this, he became obsessed with proving his theory. He spent month after month at the site just taking more measurements, gathering as much data as he possibly could. He even facilitated visits from a German astronomical team in the 1920s to help verify his calculations and make sure that he wasn't just crazy. He wrote guidebooks and gave tours to visiting scholars and even lobbied the Bolivian government to recognize the site's true importance. By the 1930s and 40s, he had become the dominant authority on Tiwanaku and Pumapunku. He spent more time studying the site than anyone else and had published multiple books, including a massive 4-volume opus. His 1945 book, Tiwanaku, the Cradle of American Man, presented his theory that Pumapunku was the birthplace of civilization in the Americas. He even developed theories about the people who had built it. By examining the skulls from tombs around the site, he concluded that there had been 2 distinct populations, an older, more advanced race with elongated skulls, and a younger, more primitive race with normal skulls. Us, humans. He published papers on the anthropology of this in 1937 and a book called What is Race in 1943. And he argued that Pumapunku proved the existence of a lost master race that had spread civilization around the world before being destroyed. Arthur died in 1946 and was absolutely convinced that he had rewritten human history. However, mainstream archaeology, science in general, refused to accept it. It would turn out that Arthur Poznański was completely wrong about almost everything. In the late 40s and 50s, scientists developed a technique called radiocarbon dating. This method could determine the age of organic materials pretty accurately. It was supposedly far more accurate than the calculations Arthur had relied on. So when they carbon dated the materials from these 2 sites, Pumapunku and Tiwanaku, the results were definitive, that the sites had actually been built around, 1300 BC. Arthur had assumed that the structures were meant to align perfectly with the solstices, but there was no evidence that the Tiwanaku builders had intended such precision. That the few degrees of difference that Arthur had detected were simply the result of construction variation, not years of axial precession. And the ancient shorelines weren't shorelines, but geologists had proved they were natural erosion patterns in the rock and were unrelated to water levels. Archaeology declared that the site had never been a port, and authors' theories about 2 distinct races were just flat out wrong. Modern DNA analysis would later show that the population of this area was genetically homogeneous, and that because of that, the skull variations he had observed were normal human diversity, not evidence of a master non-human race. And even Arthur's basic premise that the stonework being too advanced for ancient people was also wrong, because experimental archaeologists demonstrated that the precise cuts and joints at this location could be achieved using bronze tools, wooden measuring devices, and of course, enormous amounts of skilled labor. Keep in mind that the scientific community had been very skeptical of Arthur's claims from the very beginning. He had had a public dispute with a respected archaeologist, but was so convinced of his own theory, so dedicated to his research that he had dismissed all criticism as narrow-minded. But here's the truly strange part, because what if Arthur Poznański wasn't wrong? What if he truly uncovered something so profound history would have to be rewritten if released to the public? In 1969, Eric von Daniken cited Arthur's 15,000-year date in his best-selling book, Chariots of the Gods, using it as evidence for ancient astronauts. In the 1990s and 2000s, Graham Hancock referenced his work to support theories about lost civilizations. This begs the question that you guys are going to have to answer yourselves. Did he uncover something about our past that he wasn't supposed to, or did he just fabricate lies for the sake of fame and notoriety? The truth remains a mystery. And because you guys have made it this far, I want you to all comment below, Raiders of the Lost Ark. so that way I know who made it to the end and who didn't. And if you guys enjoy storytelling like this, where we deep dive into strange cases of the mysterious and supernatural, what are you waiting for? Smack that like and subscribe button right now for more content just like this. As always, never forget, I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you all in the very next episode.